The scent of spring lingered in the air as Queen Maya gazed upon the vast expanse of the Silla Palace gardens. The cherry blossoms swayed gently, their petals falling like whispers of time, each one a memory, a fragment of the past she had long carried within her. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the royal courtyard, casting long shadows that danced upon the stone pathways. Maya sat beneath the towering pagoda, her hands resting delicately on her lap, feeling the weight of the silk robes that had for decades been both her armor and her burden. She was no longer the young bride who had once walked these halls with wide, uncertain eyes. Now, she was a woman who had weathered the storms of courtly intrigue. A mother who had fought against the tides of tradition. A queen who had stood beside a king in his most desperate moments. Yet, despite the years that had passed, despite the losses and victories, the betrayals and triumphs, she had never felt the loneliness as deeply as she did now. With each passing season, the court grew more restless, the whispers of change rippling through the air. Her husband, King Jinpyeong, had ruled for decades, yet his strength was waning. And soon, their daughter, her beloved Dokmin, would face the battle that Maya herself had fought all her life, the battle for acceptance in a world ruled by men. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift back to the beginning. Back to the days when she was not yet a queen, not yet a mother, but simply a girl chosen by fate to stand at the heart of a kingdom in turmoil. Maya had been born into privilege, the daughter of Galmunwang Boksong, a noble of Silla, whose name carried the weight of generations. From a young age, she had been taught that duty outweighed desire, that a woman's place was beside her husband, serving as both his anchor and his shadow. She was raised among courtiers, learning the intricate dance of politics, mastering the unspoken language of the royal court, where a single glance could mean the difference between favor and disgrace. Her beauty was whispered about throughout the kingdom, but it was not beauty that secured her future, it was blood. Her lineage made her an ideal match for Prince Baekjeong, the young heir who would one day become King Jinpyeong. Their marriage had been decided long before they ever met, a bond forged not out of love, but out of necessity. When she first laid eyes on Baekjeong, she had expected a boy weighed down by the crown that would one day be his. Instead, she found a quiet, watchful young man, his eyes sharp with intelligence, yet burdened by something she could not yet name. He was not like the other nobles' sons, who flaunted their status with arrogance. No, Baekjeong carried himself with an air of caution, as if he had already learned the painful truth that power was as much a curse as it was a gift. Their wedding was a grand affair, filled with feasts and music, with nobles toasting to their union as if it were the beginning of an era of prosperity. But beneath the golden splendor, Maya felt the cold hand of fate press against her back. She was no longer just a noblewoman, she was now bound to the destiny of Silla itself. The years that followed were filled with lessons far harsher than those of her childhood. Being the wife of a prince was one thing, being the wife of a king was another. She watched as Baekjeong grew into his role, his shoulders broadening under the weight of expectation. And when the day finally came that he ascended to the throne as King Jinpyeong, she stood by his side, adorned in the robes of a queen, her face serene even as her heart pounded with the knowledge that their greatest battles were still ahead. The court was a battlefield of whispers and shifting alliances, where a misplaced word could mean ruin. Maya quickly learned that her beauty and lineage would not protect her, only her mind would. She became a quiet force within the palace, her presence never demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore. She advised Jinpyeong in matters where others dared not speak, guiding him through the labyrinth of court politics, ensuring that those who sought to undermine him found themselves ensnared by their own ambitions. But for all her cunning, for all her resilience, there was one thing even she could not change: the laws of Silla, which dictated that a king must be succeeded by a son, and she had no son to give. When Dokmin was born, Maya had held her close, feeling the warmth of the tiny body against her chest, knowing that she had given birth not just to a daughter, but to a question that would one day divide the kingdom. The court had expected a prince, a warrior to take up the sword after Jinpyeong. Instead, they had been given a girl. Maya had seen the disappointment in the noble's eyes, the murmurs that spread like wildfire through the palace. But she had also seen something else, something they did not yet understand. She had seen the fire in Dokmin's eyes, the same sharp intelligence that had drawn her to Baekjung all those years ago. And in that moment, Maya had made a silent vow: if the world would not accept her daughter, then she would shape the world until it did. Her battle had begun, but she did not fight with swords or with armies. She fought with patience, with whispers planted in the right ears, with alliances forged in the shadows. She raised Dokmin not as a girl doomed to be forgotten, but as a ruler in the making. She taught her the lessons that she herself had learned, the art of diplomacy, the weight of words, the strength found not in brute force, but in wisdom. Yet, as the years passed, the whispers grew louder. Silla's enemies were watching, waiting for the moment of weakness that would come when Jinpyeong's reign ended. The nobles grew restless, unwilling to see a woman ascend the throne. And though Maya had spent a lifetime weaving the threads of destiny, she knew that even she could not hold them together forever. The night breeze carried the scent of cherry blossoms through the air, and Maya opened her eyes. Returning to the present, the sun had nearly set, the sky painted in hues of crimson and gold. She rose slowly, her movements careful, as if the weight of history pressed upon her shoulders. Tomorrow, she would return to the court, to the endless struggles that had defined her life. She would stand beside her husband. She would guide her daughter. She would fight as she had always fought. But tonight, for just a moment, she allowed herself to be something else. Not a queen, not a strategist, not a warrior in the shadows. Just a woman who had loved, who had lost, who had given everything for a kingdom that had never truly seen her. The last petals of the cherry blossoms drifted to the ground, and Maya turned away, stepping back into the halls of the palace, where history awaited her next move. The echoes of war drums still lingered in the air when Jinpyeong ascended the throne. The kingdom of Silla, though adorned with the gilded splendor of its palaces and the ancient wisdom of its scholars, was anything but stable. It stood on the precipice of uncertainty, caught between the ever-looming shadows of its two powerful rivals, Baekje to the west and Goguryeo to the north. And within its own walls, the court was riddled with deceit. Noble factions vying for influence like wolves circling their prey. Maya had known from the moment Jinpyeong was crowned that her role was far from ceremonial. She was not simply a queen to bear children and bask in luxury. She was his shield, his confidant, his unseen hand guiding the kingdom away from the abyss. She remembered that day clearly, the day her husband was forced to claim the throne. The grand hall of Wolsong Palace was heavy with the scent of incense, curling through the rafters like the spirits of ancestors watching over the coronation. Jinpyeong, clad in golden robes embroidered with the sigils of Silla, knelt before the sacred altar. His expression composed, yet his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. Maya stood behind him, her own robes flowing like a river of silk, her face a mask of quiet resolve. The high priest, his voice deep and solemn, recited the sacred rites, calling upon the gods to bless the new king. But Maya could hear what lay beneath the surface, the murmurs of the gathered nobles, the whispers of doubt, of skepticism. Jinpyeong was young, too young, some said, a boy barely out of adolescence, now expected to lead a kingdom that was teetering on the brink of war. And worse, he carried the stain of his father's disgrace. King Jinji, his father, had not died in glory but in shame. Deposed by the very court that now stood before them, the nobles had turned against him, branding him unfit to rule. And though Jinpyeong had done nothing to inherit his father's crimes, the ghosts of that betrayal clung to him. Maya saw the way the ministers exchanged glances, their eyes cold and calculating. They were not here to pledge their loyalty. They were here to measure the new king, to test his strength, to see if he could be manipulated. When Jinpyeong finally rose, the golden crown resting on his brow, she could see the weight of it pressing into him, not just in its physical form, but in the burden it now represented. The kingdom was his, but the fight to keep it had only just begun. The early years of Jinpyeong's reign were marked by turbulence. Baekje wasted no time in testing the young king's mettle, launching a series of brutal raids on Silla's western borders. Villages were burned, crops were stolen, and the cries of the people for a strong leader grew louder with each passing day. At court, the ministers, led by the most powerful noble families, offered conflicting counsel. Some urged immediate retaliation, others whispered of appeasement. and a few even suggested abandoning the borderlands altogether to consolidate power in the capital. It was chaos, and Jinpyong was drowning in it. Maya saw it all. She saw the exhaustion in her husband's eyes. The way he pored over war maps late into the night. The way he barely touched his meals. His mind consumed by the growing crisis. She had not been raised to be a military leader. But she understood people, how they thought, how they schemed, how they could be controlled. One evening, as the golden lanterns flickered in their private chambers, she approached him. "You cannot win this war if you cannot control your own court," she said simply, pouring a cup of warm tea and placing it before him. Jinpyong exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "I know that," he admitted, his voice quieter than the man who had stood before the nobles on his coronation day. "But they do not see me as a king. They see me as my father's son." "Then show them who you are." He looked up at her, his sharp gaze searching hers. "And who am I, Maya?" She met his eyes steadily. "You are the man who will break their expectations. But first, you must give them something to fear." Fear. It was not a word Jinpyong had been raised to wield. He had been taught to rule with wisdom, with justice, but justice alone could not tame the wolves that lurked in his court. So they made a plan. The royal council gathered in the grand chamber the next day, expecting yet another fruitless debate over Silla's military response. The ministers, draped in their ceremonial robes, took their seats, their faces composed but their thoughts already scheming. Jinpyong entered in silence, his expression unreadable, and took his place at the head of the chamber. Beside him stood Maya, her presence as regal as ever, though she spoke no words. The discussion began as usual, one noble calling for peace, another arguing for war, voices rising and clashing like the swords of rival warriors. And then Jinpyong did something they had not expected. He stood. "My father was weak," he declared, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "He was deposed because he allowed himself to be swayed by men like you, men who speak in circles, who serve their own interests above Silla's." A hush fell over the chamber. "Let me be clear," he continued, his eyes sweeping across the room. "I am not my father." Then, with a wave of his hand, the doors to the chamber swung open. Guards entered, dragging in two noblemen, lords who had been quietly feeding information to Baekje in exchange for their own security. Gasps filled the room. The accused men protested, swearing their innocence, but Jinpyong did not waver. The evidence had already been prepared. The confessions extracted in the dark corners of the palace where Maya's influence ran deep. Without hesitation, Jinpyong gave the order. Before the eyes of the court, the traitors were executed. Blood stained the golden floors of the chamber. And in that moment, the ministers understood, this was no boy king. This was a ruler who would not be trifled with. That night, in the privacy of their chambers, Jinpyong turned to Maya. "They will hate me for this," he murmured, the weight of his actions settling upon him. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his own. "Let them," she said softly. "A king who is feared is a king who is obeyed." He studied her for a long moment. And then, ever so slightly, he nodded. The kingdom was still fragile. The battle still far from over. But that night, for the first time, Maya saw the first embers of something greater burning in her husband's eyes. The embers of a king who would endure. And she would be there, by his side, to ensure that those embers became a fire that no enemy, within or beyond Silla, could extinguish. The halls of Wolsong Palace were alive with tension. The heavy scent of ink and parchment filled the air as scribes hurriedly transcribed messages, their hands moving swiftly over the delicate silk scrolls. Outside, the capital bustled with an energy that was both anxious and expectant. News of King Jinpyong's decisive actions against the traitorous nobles had spread far and wide. Some feared him now, while others, those who had once doubted him, began to see him as a true king. But fear alone would not keep Silla safe. Maya knew this better than anyone. She stood at the balcony of her private quarters, overlooking the courtyard below, where rows of royal guards patrolled the grounds. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the stone paths. The weight of her responsibilities pressed against her, yet she did not allow it to bow her shoulders. The kingdom needed more than a ruler with a firm hand. It needed alliances, stability, and foresight. It needed a queen who could see beyond the battlefield. The war with Baekje had escalated. Their raids had become bolder, their forces testing the defenses of Silla's border villages. At the same time, Goguryeo loomed in the north, an ever-present threat, its armies watching for any sign of weakness. To the west, beyond the seas, the powerful Sui dynasty of China had grown restless, its emperor looking for opportunities to extend his influence. Jinpyong's advisors clamored for a military solution. They spoke of fortifying defenses, of striking Baekje before they could strike Silla. But war required resources, soldiers, weapons, food, and Silla was not yet strong enough to fight on multiple fronts. It was Maya who first proposed an alternative. The Sui dynasty, she said one evening as she and Jinpyong sat alone in their chambers. They are the key. Jinpyong frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. The Sui are too far, and they have their own battles to fight. Why would they concern themselves with our wars? Because we will make it worth their while. She replied, the emperor seeks tribute, loyalty. If we offer him what he desires, we can gain his protection without spilling Silla's blood. Jinpyong leaned back, studying her carefully. You want to submit to them? Maya shook her head. No, I want to make them believe we have. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Go on. And so, a plan was set into motion. The delegation to Sui was carefully chosen, scholars, diplomats, and envoys who understood the delicate balance of words and power. Maya oversaw every detail, ensuring that Silla's tribute was both grand enough to impress and humble enough to avoid suspicion. Silk, rare herbs, and golden ornaments were prepared as gifts, each one meticulously selected to appeal to the Sui emperor's tastes. But the true brilliance of Maya's plan lay not in the gifts, but in the message they carried. The delegation was instructed to present Silla not as a desperate kingdom seeking aid, but as a devoted ally eager to prove its worth. They would emphasize Silla's strategic position, the value it could offer as a foothold against Baekje and Goguryeo. They would flatter the emperor, appeal to his vision of dominance, while subtly steering him toward a partnership rather than subjugation. And most importantly, they would secure a promise, protection in exchange for loyalty. An alliance that would ensure Baekje and Goguryeo thought twice before moving against Silla. It was a dangerous gamble. But Maya understood something that many of the court advisors did not. Power was not always taken by force. Sometimes, it was given willingly, disguised as loyalty. Months passed before word arrived from the Sui court. When the messenger entered the royal hall, his face unreadable, Maya felt her heart quicken. He knelt before the throne, presenting a sealed scroll. The entire court held its breath as Jinpyong broke the seal, his eyes scanning the elegant strokes of Chinese characters. Then, slowly, he smiled. The Emperor of Sui acknowledges our tribute, Jinpyong declared, his voice steady, deliberate. He recognizes Silla as a loyal vassal, and he warns Baekje and Goguryeo that any attack on Silla will be seen as an attack on the Sui dynasty itself. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the hall. Some of the ministers exchanged uneasy glances. Silla had, in appearance, submitted to a foreign power. But Maya knew better. They had not submitted. They had secured protection without a single drop of Silla's blood being shed. That night, as the lanterns flickered softly in their chambers, Jinpyong turned to her with something akin to admiration in his gaze. You saw this outcome before any of us did, he said. Maya reached for the scroll, running her fingers over the delicate paper. Men wage wars with swords, she murmured, but queens wage wars with words. The success of the Sui alliance changed everything. Baekje's raids ceased almost immediately, their warlords unwilling to risk the wrath of the mighty Sui Empire. Goguryeo, too, withdrew into cautious silence, shifting its focus elsewhere. Within Silla, the court began to view Maya in a different light. She was no longer just the queen consort, the quiet wife standing behind the throne. She was a strategist, a diplomat, a woman whose wisdom had saved the kingdom from unnecessary war. But with recognition came danger. Not all were pleased with her growing influence. The opposition came quietly at first, murmurs in the halls, disapproving glances from conservative ministers who believed that women had no place in matters of state. Then came the whispers of doubt, the carefully placed suggestions that Maya had overstepped, that her influence over the king was unnatural, even dangerous. And finally, there were the threats. One evening, as she walked through the palace gardens, a messenger approached her, a young boy, no older than 10, dressed in the simple garments of a palace servant. He bowed deeply before extending a small, folded parchment. Maya took it, her fingers steady even as her heart warned her to be wary. Unfolding the note, she read the single line scrawled in rough, hurried strokes. A queen should know her place. She let the parchment slip through her fingers, watching as the wind carried it away into the darkness. Maya had never been one to cower before shadows. If they wished to remove her, they would have to do more than send threats carried by frightened boys. That night, she did not speak of the note to Jinpyeong. He had enough battles to fight. This one, she would handle herself. The next morning, Maya summoned her most trusted attendants. Over cups of fragrant tea, she spoke softly, yet with unmistakable resolve. "Find out who sent the message," she instructed, "and when you do, bring them to me." She would not be silenced. She would not be cast aside. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let the old ways strip away what she had built. Silla had its king, but it also had its queen, and she would ensure that they never forgot it. The night Dokman was born, the palace was shrouded in uneasy silence. The air was thick with expectation, the tension palpable even beyond the high walls of Wolsong Palace. Servants moved with quiet urgency, their footsteps light against the polished floors, their hushed whispers weaving together a single, unspoken truth. The queen was in labor, and the fate of Silla rested in the balance. Maya lay in the dimly lit chamber, the flickering glow of lanterns casting long shadows across the silken drapes. Pain rippled through her body like waves crashing against a storm-battered shore. Yet she did not cry out. She clenched her jaw, her fingers gripping the embroidered fabric beneath her as the midwives murmured reassurances. She had been here before. Twice, and twice, she had held her breath as newborn cries filled the air, only for them to be followed by silence, by the grief-stricken faces of the attendants, by the realization that the sons she had carried had never drawn breath beyond the womb. Now, as another child fought its way into the world, she did not allow herself to hope. Hope was a fragile thing, easily broken. Then, at long last, a sharp cry pierced the stillness. A daughter. The midwife placed the small, squirming child in Maya's trembling arms. Tiny hands, delicate features, dark eyes that blinked up at her as if already seeing more than a newborn should. She was so small, yet her presence filled the room, filled Maya's heart with something unexpected. Not disappointment, not regret, but fierce, unwavering love. Jinpyeong entered moments later, his face weary from sleepless nights of waiting, from the burdens of ruling a kingdom that seemed to demand more from him with each passing day. The sight of his wife, pale but alive, and their child, alive, made his breath catch in his throat. "A girl," one of the attendants murmured, their tone tinged with apprehension. A king needed sons. Everyone knew this. Maya saw the flicker of uncertainty in her husband's eyes. But before he could speak, she did. "She is strong," Maya said, her voice steady, stronger than they will ever know. Jinpyeong looked down at the child in her arms, at the way she clenched her tiny fists as if already prepared to fight. And slowly, his expression softened. He reached out, his fingers brushing against his daughter's small hand. "Dokman," he murmured. The name settled over them like a whispered promise. She would not be a son, but she would be something more. The years passed, and Dokman grew. From the beginning, she was different, unlike the other princesses, who were raised in the safety of the women's quarters, who were taught only the skills of a noblewoman, how to weave, how to sing, how to remain silent. Dokman sought more. She wandered where she was not supposed to, listened to conversations not meant for her ears. She climbed the stone walls of the palace gardens, dirt smudging her fine silk robes, and laughed when she tumbled down. She was quick-witted, her mind as sharp as the jeweled hairpins she carelessly abandoned in favor of wooden sticks she used as makeshift swords. The palace attendants clucked their tongues. The ministers frowned. "She is too wild," they whispered, "too curious, too bold." Maya listened to them but did not heed their warnings. She watched her daughter carefully, saw the way her mind worked, the way she absorbed the world around her like a river carving its path through stone. The court would never accept her. That much was certain. A woman could not rule. They would say, a woman was meant to stand behind, not ahead. But Maya had spent a lifetime bending the world to her will. She would not let them break her daughter's spirit. As Dokmin grew older, Maya took it upon herself to oversee her education. Not the delicate, ornamental lessons of a princess, but the teachings of rulers. At night, when the palace halls were silent, when the court was lost in the comforts of their own ambitions, Maya would bring her daughter to the study. She unrolled maps of Silla, traced her fingers over the borders that shifted with every war, every alliance. She pointed to the names of Baekje and Goguryeo, to the distant land of the Sui dynasty, and told her stories not of romance, but of strategy, of diplomacy, of survival. She taught Dokmin the art of words, how to listen more than she spoke, how to see the currents of politics beneath the surface of every conversation. She taught her patience, and most of all, she taught her resilience. The world will not give you power, Dokmin, Maya told her one evening as they sat beneath the flickering lantern light. You must take it. Dokmin, now 10 years old, looked up at her mother. Her dark eyes filled not with fear, but with something deeper, something unbreakable. I will, she said simply. But the world was not kind to those who defied its expectations. The whispers in court grew louder. A queen who meddled in matters of state was already a threat. But a daughter raised not as a pawn to be married off, but as a ruler in the making? That was something far more dangerous. The ministers began to conspire. Jinpyong, caught between the traditions of his ancestors and the love for his wife and child, hesitated. He knew that Dokmin was extraordinary, that she was meant for more than what the court would allow. But he also knew the dangers that came with it. One evening, as Maya stood in the courtyard, watching Dokmin practice with a wooden staff, Jinpyong approached her. His face was troubled, his voice low. They will not let her rule, he said. They will not even let her stand beside us if they see what she is becoming. Maya turned to him, her gaze unwavering. Then we must make them see what she already is. Jinpyong exhaled, shaking his head. And if they try to take her from us? If they decide she is too much of a threat? Maya's fingers tightened around the silk folds of her sleeves. The thought had crossed her mind more times than she could count. If they wish to take her, she said softly, then they will have to go through me first. The first true test of Dokmin's future came sooner than expected. It began with an invitation, an offer from one of the most powerful noble families of Silla. A marriage proposal. The minister who delivered the message did so with the air of someone who believed the matter was already settled. A noblewoman, after all, was expected to marry, even a princess. But Maya saw through the words, through the carefully constructed illusion of respect. This was no offer. It was an attempt to remove Dokmin from the equation, to make her a pawn rather than a player. Maya listened to the minister's words with a serene expression. When he finished, she smiled. The princess thanks you for your concern, she said smoothly, but she is not yet of age to marry. The minister's smile faltered. Your Majesty, she is 13. Many noble girls are married by this age. Maya's smile remained, but there was steel beneath it. My daughter is not many noble girls. The minister hesitated, then bowed. But as he left, Maya knew this was only the beginning. They would come for Dokmin. And when they did, Maya would be ready. She had spent her life protecting her husband, guiding him through the storms of politics and war. Now, she would do the same for her daughter. Because Dokmin was not just her child. She was the future of Silla. The corridors of Wolsong Palace had always been filled with whispers. But now they had become a storm. The court no longer hid its concerns behind polite smiles and veiled words. Rumors spread like wildfire, each one more dangerous than the last. The ministers spoke in hushed tones of the king's failure to produce a male heir, of a queen who overstepped her bounds, of a princess who did not behave as a princess should. Maya had expected this. She had seen it coming long before Dokmin had even taken her first steps. But knowing the battle was coming did not make the fight any easier. She stood on the balcony of her chambers, watching as the palace below bustled with movement. Servants hurried to and fro. Guards patrolled the perimeter. And in the training yard, her daughter stood with a wooden staff in hand, facing an older boy nearly twice her size. Dokmin lunged forward, striking fast, but the boy dodged with ease, countering with a sweep that sent her stumbling. She hit the ground with a grunt, dust rising around her. Maya tensed, waiting to see what her daughter would do next. Dokman did not cry out. She did not look to anyone for help. She gritted her teeth, pushed herself back to her feet, and raised her staff again. Maya allowed herself a small smile. She would need that resilience soon enough. The first attempt on Dokman's life came in the dead of night. Maya had been restless, her instincts keeping her awake despite the late hour. She was in the royal study when she heard the muffled sound of footsteps where there should have been none. She moved swiftly, her silk robes whispering against the stone floor as she made her way toward Dokman's quarters. The guards stationed outside were alert, but there was something in their posture that put Maya on edge, a stiffness. As if they had only just assumed their positions. She stepped inside. The room was dark, the lanterns extinguished, but she could see the figure standing over her daughter's bed. A blade gleamed in the faint moonlight. Raised high, Maya did not hesitate. She seized a bronze candle holder from the nearby table and struck the intruder across the back of the head. The figure crumpled, the dagger clattering to the ground. Dokman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She gasped, sitting up as the guards rushed in. The assassin was dragged away. But Maya did not wait for explanations. She turned to the nearest guard, her voice sharp as steel. "Find out who sent him," she commanded. Now, the guards hesitated. Jin Pyong arrived moments later, his robe hastily thrown over his shoulders, his face pale with fury. Maya met his gaze. "They have made their move," she said. "Now it is our turn." By morning, the assassin had been interrogated. He had not broken easily. But fear was a powerful motivator. He had been sent by a noble family that had long opposed Jin Pyong's reign. They had been growing bolder, sensing weakness in the absence of a male heir. This was their message, a warning that Silla would not accept a queen. Maya listened to the confession in silence. When the assassin had finished speaking, she dismissed the guards, leaving only herself, Jin Pyong, and the prisoner in the dimly lit chamber. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Did you think she would die so easily?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with venom. "Did you think I would allow it?" The man trembled, sweat beading on his forehead. Maya crouched before him, tilting her head. "You are a fool," she whispered, "and those who sent you are even greater fools." She rose and turned to Jin Pyong. "This cannot go unanswered." Jin Pyong exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face. "We cannot afford civil unrest. We cannot afford weakness," Maya countered. "If we do not strike back, they will try again." There was a long silence. Then, finally, Jin Pyong nodded. That afternoon, the noble family responsible for the attempt on Dokman's life was stripped of their lands and titles. Their power was dismantled, their wealth confiscated. The head of the family, once a man who had spoken boldly against the king, was made an example of. Exiled to the farthest reaches of Silla. The message was clear. Maya had ensured it. Dokman was not afraid. That was what struck Maya the most. After the assassination attempt, she had expected her daughter to be shaken, to seek comfort, but Dokman did not cry. She did not cling to her mother's side. Instead, she looked Maya in the eye and said, "Teach me how to fight." Maya hesitated. "That is not your path." "It must be," Dokman insisted, "if I am to survive." Maya studied her daughter carefully. Dokman's dark eyes were steady, unyielding. There was no fear in them, only determination. And Maya understood. She had spent years shielding Dokman from the dangers of the court, from the expectations that would seek to bind her. But Dokman did not want to be shielded. She wanted to stand on her own. So Maya relented. She arranged for Dokman to train, not with wooden staffs in the practice yard, but with the best warriors Silla had to offer. She would never be a soldier, never march onto the battlefield like a man, but she would know how to defend herself. She would learn the art of war, the strategies that shaped empires. And in the quiet of their private lessons, Maya taught her something even more valuable. The greatest weapon you will ever have, she told her daughter, is not the blade in your hand, but the mind in your skull. Dokman nodded, absorbing every word, and Maya knew then, beyond all doubt, that her daughter would not just survive. She would thrive. The threats did not stop. But Maya was always one step ahead. She cultivated alliances carefully, ensuring that the noble families who once doubted them began to see Dokman not as a liability, but as a force to be reckoned with. She orchestrated strategic marriages among the court, weaving a web of loyalty that would protect her daughter when the time came. And when whispers arose again, when voices spoke of finding a new heir, of placing another family on the throne, Maya silenced them. Sometimes with words, sometimes with quiet, decisive action, she did what needed to be done. Because she was not just a queen. She was a mother, and she would protect her daughter at all costs. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dokman sat beside her mother in the gardens. The palace was quiet, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. "You fight so hard for me," Dokman murmured. "Will you always?" Maya turned to her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "For as long as I breathe." Dokman hesitated. "And when you no longer do?" Maya smiled softly. "Then I will have already given you everything you need to fight for yourself." The young princess was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. And in that moment, Maya knew. She had won. Her daughter was ready. The drums of war had always echoed in the distance. But now, they were deafening. Maya could hear them in the anxious murmurs of the court, in the frantic scribbling of military strategists hunched over maps, in the restless pacing of her husband as he weighed decisions that could shape the future of Silla. War had never truly left the kingdom, it had only been waiting. Like a patient predator watching for weakness. And now, with Baekje and Goguryeo moving against them, the time for waiting was over. She stood on the balcony of the palace, watching as soldiers trained in the courtyard below. Their swords clashed, their voices rang out in disciplined unison. But she saw the tension in their movements, the awareness that this was no ordinary drill. This was preparation for survival. A war was coming, and it would test everything she had built. Baekje struck first. The attack came under the cover of night, swift and merciless. Border villages burned, their cries swallowed by the darkness as enemy forces swept through the countryside like wildfire. By dawn, Silla's messengers had arrived at the palace, their faces ashen, their words sharp as blades. "Baekje's armies marched toward our heartlands," one reported, dropping to his knees before King Jinpyong. "They move fast. If we do not stop them soon, they will reach the capital." The war council convened immediately. Maya sat beside Jinpyong, listening as the generals debated their options. Some called for immediate retaliation. Others urged caution. A few, the more cautious voices in the room, whispered of negotiations, of sending envoys to buy time. Maya studied them all, her expression unreadable. She had spent years learning the art of war, not with a sword in hand, but with the weight of strategy. She had read the histories, watched as the great nations of the past rose and fell, and she understood one simple truth. A kingdom that waited for mercy was a kingdom that did not survive. She turned to Jinpyong. "We cannot afford hesitation," she said quietly. "Baekje has made its move. If we do not respond with strength, they will see it as weakness." Jinpyong exhaled, his hands tightening into fists. "Then we fight." The armies of Silla rode out at dawn. Maya stood at the gates of the palace, watching as ranks of soldiers, their armor gleaming in the rising sun, marched through the city streets. The people watched in silence, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. War was not new to them, but every war came with the unspoken question: would this be the last? Among those preparing to leave was General Yulia, one of Silla's most trusted commanders. He was a seasoned warrior, a man who had seen more battles than most. Yet even he wore the burden of uncertainty. He approached Maya before mounting his horse. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing his head, "do you believe we will win this?" Maya met his gaze. "You do not fight for victory," she said. "You fight to ensure there is a future for Silla. If you remember that, then no matter the outcome, we do not lose." Yulia nodded slowly, her words settling over him like an unspoken vow. Then, with a final bow, he turned and rode out with his men. Maya watched them disappear into the horizon, and she prayed that when they returned, they would not be fewer. The war was brutal. The battle at the Nakdong River was the first major clash, and it was unlike anything Silla had faced before. Baekje's forces were relentless, their strategies sharp, their movements precise. For days, the battlefield was a storm of blood and steel, the river running red with the fallen. News arrived in fragments, messengers galloping into the capital with reports of victories and losses. each one a small piece of the greater puzzle. Jin Pyong spent sleepless nights in the war room, poring over maps, his fingers tracing the lines of the kingdom's borders as if willing them to hold. Maya was there with him. She did not fight with swords, but she fought in her own way. She kept the court in check, ensuring that the ministers did not descend into panic. She managed supplies, overseeing the distribution of grain and resources to sustain both the army and the people. And when necessary, she made difficult decisions that would stain her hands with unseen blood but would keep the kingdom from fracturing. One night, as Jin Pyong sat with his head in his hands, exhaustion weighing heavily upon him, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You cannot carry this alone," she murmured. He exhaled sharply. "If I falter, if I make the wrong choice, it is not just me who falls. It is all of Silla." Maya knelt before him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Then let me bear it with you." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. And together, they endured. Goguryeo watched. They had remained silent through the war's early days, their armies stationed at the northern borders, unmoving, but Maya knew it was not out of loyalty or disinterest. Goguryeo was waiting, watching. They would strike when it suited them. And so, before they could, Maya made the first move. Through secret messengers, she sent word to the Sui dynasty in China, reminding them of Silla's alliance. She knew the Sui had their own reasons to distrust Goguryeo. The northern kingdom was a threat even to the mighty empire. The response came swiftly. A fleet of Sui warships set sail, not for Silla, but toward Goguryeo's shores. And just like that, Goguryeo's focus shifted. They could no longer afford to watch Silla when they now had an empire breathing down their necks. Maya had bought Silla time. Baekje did not expect Silla to endure. They had thought the war would be swift, that Silla would crumble before their might. But they had underestimated their enemy. They had underestimated a king who refused to break. They had underestimated a queen who saw beyond the battlefield. They had underestimated a princess who was learning what it meant to survive. The war dragged on for months. But in the end, Silla did not fall. Baekje, exhausted and unable to hold its occupied territories, was forced to retreat. Their armies withdrew, their ambitions momentarily crushed. The war was over. But the scars it left behind would never fade. When the soldiers returned, the people of Silla lined the streets, welcoming them home with cheers and tears alike. Families reunited, lovers embraced, and the kingdom exhaled the breath it had been holding for too long. Maya stood at the gates once more, watching as the remnants of Silla's army marched through. She searched their faces, looking for the ones who had left but would not return. There were too many empty spaces. Jin Pyong, standing beside her, saw it too. "We won," he said, though his voice was hollow. Maya reached for his hand. "We survived," she corrected. And sometimes, that was all a kingdom could do. That night, as the lanterns burned low and the palace quieted, Maya found Dokman sitting alone in the gardens. The princess had changed. War had a way of doing that, even for those who never stepped onto the battlefield. "You were right," Dokman said softly. "The world will not give me power." Maya sat beside her. "No, it will not." Dokman turned to face her mother, eyes filled with something fierce. "Then I will take it." Maya felt something swell in her chest, not fear, but pride. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Dokman's face, just as she had done when she was a child. "You will," Maya whispered, "and I will make sure no one stands in your way." The war had ended, but another battle had just begun. The halls of Wolzong Palace no longer echoed with the cries of war, but with something far more insidious, whispers. They slithered through the corridors like serpents, winding their way through the noble families, the ministers, the courtiers. Some voices spoke of Silla's resilience, of the kingdom's survival against Baekje. But others carried a different message. The king had no son. Silla had endured the war, but it would not survive a queen. Maya had always known this moment would come. She had spent years preparing for it, maneuvering through the court's politics, silencing dissent before it could take root. But now, with the kingdom at peace, the nobles turned their attention inward. They sought a male heir, someone to inherit the throne and continue Silla's legacy. And they would do everything in their power to ensure that it was not Dokman. The first challenge came subtly. A delegation of high-ranking ministers gathered before King Jinpyong one morning. Their expressions solemn, their words carefully chosen. "Your Majesty," one of them began, bowing deeply, "we are deeply grateful for your leadership during the war. Your wisdom has guided Silla through its darkest days." Jinpyong remained silent, sensing what was coming. Another minister stepped forward. "But now, we must think of the future. The kingdom needs stability. It needs certainty." He paused. "It needs a male successor." The words were spoken with deference, but their meaning was clear. Jinpyong's jaw tightened. "Dokman is my heir." A murmur rippled through the council. Some of the ministers exchanged glances, while others lowered their gazes in what seemed like reluctant submission. The eldest among them, an advisor who had served under 3 kings before Jinpyong, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "Silla has never been ruled by a woman." The air in the chamber grew heavy. It was not a direct challenge. Not yet, but it was the first stone cast. Jinpyong's gaze flickered toward Maya, who sat beside him. She met his eyes, then spoke. "Then perhaps it is time for Silla to change." The room fell into stunned silence. Maya's voice had always carried weight in court, but never before had she spoken so boldly, so openly. The ministers hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, one of the more ambitious nobles, sighed heavily. "A kingdom led by a queen will be seen as weak," he said. "Our enemies will exploit it. The people will not accept it." Maya tilted her head. "And yet, they accepted my leadership in times of war. They accepted my diplomacy with the sway. They accepted my protection of the royal family." Her gaze was sharp. Was Silla weak then? The noble flinched but did not answer. Jinpyong exhaled slowly. "This discussion is over," he said firmly. "Dokman is my daughter. She is my heir." The ministers bowed, but as they left the chamber, Maya could see it in their faces. This was far from over. The next attack was less subtle. A faction of nobles began to push for an alternative heir, a distant male relative of the royal family. A cousin to Jinpyong. They spoke of tradition, of the need for stability. And soon, the whispers turned into open discussions. Dokman was only 15, though she had been trained in the ways of leadership. In politics, in war, the court saw her as a girl. And so, they sought to remove her. The first attempt was political. A proposal was brought forth, one that suggested Dokman be married to a nobleman of high standing. Someone who could advise her and guide her should she ever come to power. Maya immediately recognized it for what it was. A way to strip Dokman of her independence. If they could not keep her from inheriting the throne, they would ensure she never truly ruled. The council convened once more, this time with greater urgency. A nobleman stepped forward, bowing before Jinpyong. "Your Majesty, the people need assurance that your heir will be supported by a strong leader." He turned slightly, his gaze flickering toward Dokman, who sat beside her mother. A husband would provide such strength. Dokman did not react. She had been trained well. Jinpyong frowned, glancing at Maya. He knew better than to answer before his wife spoke. Maya folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm. "And which noble family do you propose for such a union?" The noble smiled, believing he had the upper hand. "My son," he said smoothly, "a warrior, a scholar, a man well versed in the governance of." "No." The word came not from Jinpyong, not from Maya, but from Dokman. The room fell silent. The noble looked stunned, his mouth slightly open. "Princess," he said, forcing a smile, "this is a matter of." "I said no." Dokman stood, her hands steady at her sides. She was young, but she did not waver. "I will not be married off as a means to control me." She continued, "If you wish for a strong leader, then let me prove my own strength." The court was stunned into silence. Maya watched her daughter with quiet pride. The nobles had expected submission. They had expected compliance. They had not expected defiance. Jinpyong finally spoke, his voice firm. "The princess has given her answer." The noble hesitated, then bowed, though his expression was dark with displeasure. Maya knew what would happen next. If politics could not stop Dokman, then the court would turn to something more dangerous. The second assassination attempt came 2 weeks later. It was meant to be subtle, a slow poison, slipped into Dokman's tea. But Maya had spent too many years navigating the dangers of the court to miss such a thing. She had ordered Dokman's food and drink tested by a trusted servant. And when the poison was discovered, Maya knew there could be no more patience. The next morning, she summoned the court. Jin Pyong sat at the head of the chamber, his face grave. Maya stood beside him, a small, unassuming vial in her hand. "This," she said, holding it up for all to see, "was found in the princess's cup." A ripple of unease spread through the room. "This is not a disagreement," Maya continued, her voice cold. "This is treason." Silence. Then, finally, one of the more powerful nobles, the same one who had proposed Dokman's marriage, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if there has been an attack, we must investigate. But surely you do not believe the entire court." "I believe," Maya interrupted, "that someone in this room would rather see my daughter dead than see her rule." She let the words hang in the air. The noble hesitated. "Your Majesty, you must understand." "No." Maya's voice was sharp as a blade. "It is you who must understand." She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the court. "I have spent my life ensuring this kingdom's survival," she said. "I have protected its borders, secured its alliances, ensured its future." She turned to Dokman. "And now, that future stands before you." She looked back at the court. "Make no mistake," she said, her voice like iron. "If any of you attempt to take that future from her again, I will ensure that you do not live to see it." The court did not speak. They understood. The struggle for succession was not over. The nobles would scheme, the ministers would plot, but that day, something shifted. They no longer doubted that Dokman could rule. They feared that she would. The night was still, but within the palace walls, it was anything but peaceful. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of history pressing against the stone pillars of Wolsong Palace. Torches flickered along the corridors, their glow illuminating the faces of courtiers, ministers, and noble families who had gathered for what would be one of the most defining moments in Silla's history. Dokman stood at the center of it all. She was not dressed in the silks of a mere princess but in the ceremonial robes of a ruler. Deep crimson and gold, embroidered with the sigils of Silla. Her attire was not one of adornment, it was a declaration. The jade crown, delicate yet unmistakable, rested upon her brow, marking her as the heir. Maya stood beside her, the weight of years in her gaze. For so long, she had fought for this moment. She had fought against tradition, against enemies seen and unseen, against the forces of history itself. And now, as she looked at her daughter standing before the court, she knew they had won. But the final battle was yet to come. King Jinpyong had ruled for decades, but time had begun to take its toll. His once unyielding frame had weakened, his voice no longer carrying the same command it once did. Illness had begun to creep into his bones, and though he still sat upon the throne, everyone in the court knew the truth. Silla would soon need a new ruler. The nobles had fought against it. The ministers had schemed in the shadows. But as the years passed, one fact had become undeniable. Dokman was the only one who could take the throne. And so, after years of struggle, the king made the declaration that would change the course of history. "My daughter," he said, his voice carrying across the great hall, "shall be my successor." A murmur rippled through the gathered court. Even now, even after all the battles fought, there were those who resisted. Some lowered their gazes in reluctant submission, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Then, one of the nobles, a man who had long opposed Dokman's rise, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, though there was steel in his voice, "we are forever loyal to our king. But we must ask, will the people accept this?" Jinpyong looked at him, but before he could answer, Dokman spoke. "They will," she said. All eyes turned to her. She stepped forward, her posture unshaken, her voice steady. "The people of Silla do not serve tradition," she continued. "They serve strength. They serve a ruler who will protect them, who will guide them, who will see them through war and peace alike." She let her gaze sweep over the assembly, her presence commanding. "You doubt me," she said. "You wonder if I am fit to rule." She gestured toward the assembled nobles. "Tell me, then, who among you has fought as I have? Who among you has faced death and survived?" Silence. "You call me unfit because I am a woman," Dokman said. "And yet, it was my mother who ensured Silla's survival. It was my mother who outmaneuvered Baekje, who held this court together, Who defended my father's reign when others sought to tear it apart? She turned to Maya, her voice firm. I am my mother's daughter. Maya felt a pang of emotion rise in her chest. Dokman continued, I have learned the art of war from our greatest generals. I have learned the art of politics from the most cunning minds in this court. I have seen firsthand what it means to rule. And I tell you now, I will not fail. Her words hung in the air. And slowly, something shifted. One by one, the nobles lowered their heads. They would not speak against her. They could not, because the truth was before them. Undeniable. Silla had its next ruler. And she was standing right before them. Jinpyeong's health worsened in the months that followed. Maya remained by his side, watching as the man she had stood beside for so long grew weaker by the day. He had been a great king, a just ruler, but even kings could not defy time. One evening, as they sat alone in their chambers, he reached for her hand. She will be greater than I ever was, he murmured. Maya squeezed his hand gently. She will be what Silla needs. He smiled faintly. That is what you have always ensured. She said nothing, because there was nothing more to say. The day Jinpyeong died, the bells of the palace tolled, their mournful echoes carrying across the land. Maya stood in the great hall, draped in mourning robes, her face a mask of quiet grief. But beside her, Dokman stood in robes of gold. The transition of power was not immediate. There were still those who hesitated, still those who doubted, but when the time came, when the ministers stood before her and asked who would lead Silla into the future, Dokman did not hesitate. I will. And so, in the year 632, history was made. Dokman, daughter of Jinpyeong and Maya, was crowned as Queen Seondeok of Silla, the first woman to rule the kingdom. Maya watched from the sidelines as her daughter ascended to the throne. She had spent her life fighting for this moment, shaping the future of Silla with quiet, calculated precision. Now, her work was done, but as she looked upon Dokman, seated upon the throne, her head held high, she felt not loss, but something deeper. Pride. Her daughter had risen, and nothing, not war, not tradition, not the schemes of men, would ever bring her down. Silla belonged to her now, and the world would never forget it. The court had changed. Where once there had been resistance, there was now quiet obedience. Where there had been whispers of doubt, there were now murmurs of acceptance. And where there had been the shadow of uncertainty, now there sat a queen, Seondeok of Silla, daughter of Jinpyeong and Maya, the first woman to ever rule the kingdom. But power was a fickle thing. The nobles who had bowed their heads at her coronation had not done so out of true loyalty. They had done so out of necessity, out of an unwillingness to fight a battle they could not yet win. But they were waiting, watching for her to falter, for her reign to crumble under the weight of expectation. Maya knew this, and so, she remained by her daughter's side, not as a queen mother who sought power for herself, but as a guide, a mentor, and the shield that Dokman did not yet know she would need. The first test of Seondeok's rule came sooner than expected. A dispute arose between two noble families, one that had long been loyal to the throne, and one that had resisted Seondeok's ascent. Land, power, and influence were at stake, and the conflict threatened to spill into outright violence. The court gathered, their voices raised in argument as Seondeok listened, her expression unreadable. Maya watched her carefully. Finally, Seondeok raised a hand, and the room fell silent. She turned to the head of the rebellious noble family. You demand land that does not belong to you, she said plainly. The noble bowed his head slightly, feigning humility. Your Majesty, we ask only for what is fair. Seondeok tilted her head. Fair? She turned to the other family, the one that had remained loyal. And if I were to grant this land to them, would it not be unfair to you? The noble hesitated. It would be unjust, Your Majesty. Seondeok turned back to the first noble. Then let us speak of justice. Maya watched as her daughter leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. Silla is not ruled by the whims of noble houses, she said. It is ruled by the will of its people. If I am to decide, then I will decide based not on what benefits either of you, but what benefits Silla. The room was silent. Seondeok's voice did not waver. The land will remain as it is. If either of you continue this dispute, you will find that I am less patient than my father. The rebellious noble hesitated. Then, slowly, He lowered his head. As you command, Your Majesty. Maya exhaled softly, allowing herself a small, unseen smile. Her daughter had not just ruled. She had commanded. But wisdom alone was not enough. Seondeok was brilliant, quick-witted, sharp, and intuitive, but she was still young, still learning, and in the world of politics, mistakes were costly. One evening, as the palace quieted and the flickering lanterns cast long shadows across the corridors, Maya found her daughter sitting alone in the royal study, staring at a map of Silla. You handled the dispute well, Maya said, stepping inside. Seondeok looked up, but there was no triumph in her eyes, only exhaustion. Did I? She murmured. Or did I just delay the inevitable? Maya sat beside her. You made the right decision. Seondeok exhaled. And yet, they still doubt me. Maya studied her daughter carefully. They will always doubt you. Seondeok frowned. Then how do I rule them? Maya reached for the map, tracing her fingers over the borders of Silla. You do not rule them by force. You rule them by making them believe that following you is the only choice they have. Seondeok was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Challenges continued to arise. A drought struck the eastern provinces, causing widespread famine. The people suffered, and the nobles, rather than offering aid, hoarded their wealth, raising taxes on their lands. When word reached the palace, Seondeok was furious. They starve, and yet they demand more, she said, pacing across the throne room. Maya remained still. What will you do? Seondeok turned to her mother, her jaw tight. I will command the nobles to provide aid. They have the resources. Maya tilted her head. And if they refuse? Seondeok hesitated. Maya continued, her voice calm. They will not obey you simply because you tell them to. They will obey if they believe it benefits them. Seondeok exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Then, she opened them with renewed clarity. The next morning, she called for an assembly of the court. The famine in the eastern provinces has worsened, she announced, and Silla's nobles, as stewards of this kingdom, must answer. A murmur spread through the court, some of the wealthier nobles shifting uncomfortably. Seondeok continued, I will personally contribute from the royal treasury to aid those in need. She paused, and I invite my noble houses to do the same. The word invite was carefully chosen. Maya smiled to herself. Seondeok had learned well. No noble could outright refuse without publicly showing greed. And so, one by one, they stepped forward, offering contributions, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. And just like that, Seondeok had bent them to her will. Maya watched her daughter grow into her role, shaping the kingdom with her wisdom, her cunning, and her unwavering will. But with power came enemies. There were still those who plotted against her, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Maya knew that she could not always be there to protect her. One night, as they sat together in the royal chambers, Seondeok looked at her mother with quiet resolve. You have shielded me my whole life, she said, but now, I must stand on my own. Maya studied her daughter for a long moment. Then, she reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You are ready. Seondeok nodded, and though Maya felt a pang of sadness, she also felt something greater. Pride. Her daughter was no longer just a princess. She was a queen, and she would shape the future of Silla as no ruler before her ever had. The seasons had changed, and with them, so had Silla. What was once a kingdom embroiled in war and strife was now a land led by a queen whose wisdom had begun to reshape its future. Seondeok of Silla had proven herself beyond doubt. Her rule was firm, her mind sharp, and her presence commanding. The nobles who had once opposed her had learned to respect her. If not out of loyalty, then out of fear of what she had already accomplished. But as Silla flourished, Maya felt the weight of time settling upon her shoulders. Her work was nearly done. She had spent her life fighting, first for her husband, then for her daughter, and always for the kingdom. She had outmaneuvered her enemies, silenced those who would have seen her family fall, and secured a future where a woman could sit upon the throne without apology. But even the strongest warriors must eventually lay down their swords. Maya had never been afraid of death. She had seen it too often, had stood too close to its shadow to fear it. But there was one thing she had not prepared for, the feeling of watching from the sidelines as her daughter ruled. She was no longer needed in the way she once had been. And though she had fought so hard for this future, she found herself wondering, what happens to a queen who is no longer at war? The first signs of her illness came in whispers. At first, she ignored them, a cough, a moment of dizziness, a weakness that she brushed away as mere exhaustion. She had spent decades without rest, it made sense that her body would remind her of that. But as the weeks passed, the whispers grew louder. She could no longer hide it from Seondeok. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, mother and daughter sat together in the quiet of the royal garden. The air was cool, the scent of blooming jasmine drifting through the wind. Seondeok watched Maya carefully, her gaze filled with something unspoken. "You're unwell," she said at last. Maya smiled faintly. "I am old." "You are not old," Seondeok countered, but there was a tightness in her voice. "You are tired, and you refuse to rest." Maya reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "I have spent my life fighting," she said softly. "It is difficult to remember how to stop." Seondeok's grip tightened. "Then don't." Maya exhaled. "You don't need me anymore." Seondeok's eyes darkened. "That is not true." Maya studied her daughter, seeing not the child she had raised, but the queen she had become. "You are stronger than I ever was," she murmured, "and that is how I know you will endure." Seondeok looked away for a moment, blinking against the weight of her emotions. "Then stay," she whispered. Maya wished she could. The illness did not come swiftly, nor did it come with fanfare. It crept upon her like a slow-moving storm, stealing her strength piece by piece. Some days, she felt as if she could still command the court, still walk the palace halls as she once did. Other days, she could barely rise from her bed. Seondeok refused to leave her side. The court continued its work, but the queen spent her nights at her mother's bedside, watching over her as Maya had once watched over her in childhood. For all her wisdom, for all her power, there was one battle Seondeok could not win. She could not stop time. One evening, as the lanterns flickered softly in the dim chamber, Maya reached for her daughter's hand. "There will be those who still doubt you," she murmured. "Even now." Seondeok swallowed. "Then I will prove them wrong." Maya smiled faintly. "You already have." A long silence stretched between them. Then, at last, Maya spoke again. "Tell me of Silla," she said softly. Seondeok hesitated, then began to speak, of the reforms she had planned, of the temples she would build, of the ways she would strengthen the kingdom. Maya listened, her eyes half-lidded, her breath slow but steady. And as her daughter spoke, she felt a warmth settle in her chest. Silla was in good hands. Her work was done. Maya, queen mother of Silla, passed away quietly, surrounded by the family she had fought so hard to protect. The bells of the palace tolled for her, their mournful echoes carrying across the kingdom. The people mourned her, for though she had never worn the crown, she had shaped Silla as surely as any king before her. And Seondeok, standing upon the palace balcony, looking out over the land her mother had safeguarded, whispered a promise into the wind. "I will not fail you." Maya's legacy did not end with her death. It lived on in her daughter. It lived on in Silla. The palace was quiet. It had been weeks since Maya's passing, but her presence lingered in every stone, in every corridor, in every whispered conversation among the court. She was gone, yet she had not truly left. The kingdom bore the marks of her influence, woven into its very fabric, unshakable even by time. Seondeok stood upon the highest balcony of Wolsong Palace, gazing out over the city below. The sun had begun to set, casting hues of crimson and gold across the sky, colors that reminded her of her mother's ceremonial robes, of the fire in her eyes when she fought for the future of Silla. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it her entire life, but nothing had prepared her for the emptiness that followed. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. There was no time for grief. Not for a queen. Maya had been more than a queen consort, more than a mother, more than a strategist. She had been the architect of a new Silla. The nobles had feared her, but they had respected her more. The ministers had fought her, but they had never bested her. And when she had walked through the halls of the palace, even the most powerful men had bowed their heads, whether they admitted it or not. Seondeok had spent years watching her mother work in the shadows, shaping destinies with careful words and silent victories. And now, It was up to her to ensure that legacy endured. She would not fail. She could not fail. Because Maya had given everything so that she could stand where she did now. And she would honor that sacrifice. The first true test of her reign came swiftly. With Maya gone, some of the more ambitious nobles saw an opportunity. Whispers of rebellion reached the palace within days. Certain families, still bitter over Dokman's rise, sought to challenge her authority. They believed that without her mother's guidance, she would falter. They were wrong. When the nobles arrived at court, hoping to intimidate her, they found not a hesitant girl but a queen who had been raised in the fires of palace intrigue. Seondeok did not raise her voice. She did not issue threats. Instead, she met their challenges with unshakable confidence. "I see you have forgotten what kind of queen Silla has now," she said, her voice measured. "Let me remind you, she did not order executions. She did not resort to force. She dismantled their power piece by piece, reallocating their lands, stripping them of key positions, elevating loyal families to counter their influence. She did not need to fight them with swords. She fought them the way her mother had taught her, with strategy, with patience, with an unrelenting will. By the time she was done, they did not dare to oppose her again. Maya had trained her well. Years passed, and Seondeok's reign became legend. She built temples and observatories, strengthening not just the walls of Silla, but the minds of its people. She promoted scholars and engineers, understanding that true power came not just from military strength, but from knowledge. She led with wisdom, with cunning, with the spirit of a ruler who knew she had been born to lead. But above all, she led with the lessons her mother had given her. Maya had once told her that the greatest weapon was not a blade, but a mind sharpened by experience. Seondeok carried that lesson with her until the end of her days. One evening, many years after Maya had passed, Seondeok stood alone in the royal gardens. The cherry blossoms were in bloom, their petals drifting gently in the wind. She reached out, catching one in her palm, feeling its softness against her skin. Her mother had stood here once, had watched over her here, had taught her here. A faint breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a memory, Maya's voice, as if whispered through the wind. "You are ready." Seondeok closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something other than duty. She allowed herself to miss her mother. Then, slowly, she opened her hand and let the blossom fall. It drifted to the ground, carried away by the wind, just as Maya had been carried away by time. But her legacy remained. Seondeok turned away, her steps steady as she walked back toward the palace, toward the kingdom that had become her responsibility. Because Maya had never truly left. She lived on in Silla. She lived on in her daughter. And as long as Seondeok ruled, her mother's vision, her mother's fight, would never be forgotten.